Hi there! If we've never met before, my name's Vanilla. If we have met before, welcome back. With the release of the Switch 2 less than a week away, I wanted to make a video that kind of touches on the 3D modeling and animations in Pokemon games. I've made a couple of videos talking about the way Gen 9, specifically Scarlet and Violet, looks in particular. I think since Legend ZA is releasing on the 16th of October, that someone needs to address the fact that folks are unhappy with the way Scarlet and Violet looks, especially since ZA appears to incorporate more dynamic movements. So I want to take a look at both the 3DS models as well as the Scarlet and Violet models. Now there's a very particular reason for this, and some of you may know what it is already. There's been a discussion in the Pokemon community for a while now that when Game Freak made the jump from 2D to 3D, they became lazy. Some may say even more lazier than they were before, depending on who you ask. The problem is twofold. Some folks believe that the animations for the Pokemon are lifeless, and it's only gotten worse over the years. But even worse may be the blatant reuse of Pokemon assets for multiple games, including their animations. Now, if you've seen any of my videos, you'll know that I'm a huge fan of Pokemon, and I really enjoy the newer style of games. However, I also enjoy exploring different points of view for my own. There's definitely a plethora of folks who disagree with me. These folks believe that newer Pokemon games are the downfall of the series and that they're lifeless cash grabs. Like I said before, I made a couple of videos that kind of discussed some more abstract or technical aspects of the Gen 9 debate. In my last video, I also talked about 3D Pokemon models, but I picked some screenshots of posts folks made criticizing the graphics. They compared Scarlet and Violet in ZA to Pokemon Snap for the N64 and Gale of Darkness for the GameCube. I'm not going to look at any more screenshots here. I don't really want to do that again today. There's only so much of the same thing that you can read over and over again before you start to get overly frustrated. Although I do have to admit that a bunch of comment sections did inspire me for this video as well. There were some posts floating around on TikTok of someone who was fixing Pokemon animations, and of course the comments were filled with, "Wow, Game Freak is so lazy.
If one person can do this, imagine what a whole studio could do if they cared."
I said I wasn't gonna bring up screenshots, I lied. How can I not when everyone in these somewhat viral TikToks are ragging on the work of extremely talented artists?
You could just ignore the comments, they're probably just rage bait.
At this point, I think we've gone beyond the realm of rage bait, but you are right, I could ignore them, but I'm not going to. The original creator of those clips boasted that it only took them a very short amount of time to fix the animations of several Pokemon. And if there's one thing I go by, it's that the correct answer is not always the simplest. I can also fix animations. Anyone who has access to 3D modeling software and the internet can as well. In the background, I'm going to show you some of my workflow so you can see what goes on in the editing process. I'm not a 3D modeler by trade, so do keep that in mind throughout this video. I think it's important to recognize that making the mesh, or the character that you see, rigging, which is setting up the mesh to move with an armature, which is like a skeleton, and animation are three separate jobs. When you watch the credits roll at the end of a game or an animated movie, you'll typically see separate sections for at least these three roles. I say this to 1, clarify I'm not anywhere near a professional, and 2, that I'm inherently altering the hard work of a bunch of other folks. The models have already been completed, and I'm just here to see what they look like and kind of explore why they do what they do. But these meshes and animations were created by real tradespeople who I can guarantee spent so much time perfecting them. These folks are not just corporate drones. In this case, when you say Game Freak is lazy, you're talking about the entire team of 3D artists who made all these assets, most of whom don't even work for Game Freak directly in the first place. You think that folks who slaved over these models and animations for hours and hours on end are lazy? I'd love to see how you perform in a similar environment under the same expectations. I know for a fact I wouldn't be able to make it, and so that's why I have so much respect for the awesome work that's done. I know it took a long time to create these assets, and to make them as high quality as they are is so impressive to me. I love being able to observe and appreciate the work of actual professionals, even if I'm not really supposed to do it in this way. Let's keep in mind that the corporate entity that is Game Freak doesn't make these assets, but the individual tradespeople do. So to kind of backtrack a bit to those videos where the creator is fixing the 3DS models, that phrasing just really irritates me because nothing about them needs fixing. It's like walking up to an artist's work, nabbing their original piece without their permission, and then changing around the way it looks to the way that you think it should be. Imagine walking up to an artist at an artist alley at a convention, taking one of their prints, then changing the proportions and the posing of the characters, and then showing it off to everyone saying that it's fixed. Like, I'm sorry, maybe that's just nitpicking, but I think word choice matters when you're using someone else's work, changing it, and then using your version to talk bad about the original. Because remember, these models and animations are the work of individuals, they don't just spawn in out of nowhere. I don't want to start anything, so I'm not going to put up any of the original content for the videos that fix the models, but one of the major points the creator made was that the 3DS models' textures weren't saturated enough. And so instead of exploring why they may look that way, the creator bumps up the saturation by 30% or or whatever that means, and says that such a simple change would make the models look so much better. In my case, turning up the metallic value of the material makes the texture look so much brighter. If I alter the saturation directly using a node, it starts to look too cartoony in my opinion. Imagine what putting them in the game with that insanely increased saturation would look like. You don't know how it would react with the lighting in the game engine. I personally think it would be very difficult to look at. So instead of just assuming that there was a huge oversight of such a simple fix, maybe there's a reason that they look that way. I don't know why, but the creator has only worked on 3DS models, but I'm going to talk about the newest generation as well. I think the Scarlet and Violet models do struggle in terms of their texture saturation, but I think that this has more to do with the shader that the game engine uses rather than the texture themselves. Lilligant looks fine when it's unshaded. It has a very cute pastel color palette, which is a bit lighter than it is on its texture. When exposed to light, which my scene in Blender is not at all a recreation of Scarlet and Violet's lighting, it does lose a lot of its original color. The shader I'm using in Blender for the Scarlet and Violet models is created by Chico Eevee, and it's meant to recreate the texture shading as it exists in Scarvio. The fact that it is desaturating is an intentional decision that was made. Even though I agree that a lot of the textures in Scarlet and Violet, especially for the Pokemon, appear washed out, there's a reason why they were created like this. I don't know why, but to speculate it's just because Game Freak and their contractors are incompetent or lazy is just extremely biased. I know I don't have the knowledge to speculate why it is the way it is, but I know enough to notice that this is a deliberate design decision that was made for a reason. Whether or not it was a good one, or one that had to be made out of necessity, is a totally different discussion. So that takes care of the textures, but what about the animations themselves? The creator of the fixing videos puts up GIFs of the Gen 5 version of the Pokemon whose 3D animations they were fixing. I think this is an issue for multiple reasons. You can't sit here looking at 2D art and then expect a one-to-one recreation of sprites in a 3D environment. Translating a 2D image to a 3D environment is a difficult task, and making the model move in a way that is realistic is a totally different challenge. You don't want animations to be choppy, and when you're working with very limited animation lengths, you need to be careful how much you're having the model move between frames. The creator didn't show any of their workflow in the videos I watched, so I don't know if they altered the length of the original animations. The animations most definitely had to be kept certain lengths for a reason, and so their expressiveness is somewhat limited. It makes sense as you're allotted more frames, you can have more realistic and dynamic movements. Each of these Pokemon models has their own personality. Growlithe is a really happy puppy with a lot of energy, and so its animations show that. It has more movement than, say, Lilligant, that is a more calm and graceful Pokemon. Their animations show the difference in their disposition. I don't know about you, but the study of behavior and body language is something that's pretty out of my wheelhouse, and so what the 3D team has done is a lot more spectacular than just directly copying the movements of the 2D sprites. You can argue that you prefer the more cartoon or fantastical movements as opposed to the more realistic style of the 3D models. That's okay, but like I keep saying in these videos, that's personal preference. You may disagree with the artistic direction, but that doesn't make your perspective an absolute truth. This is just my personal observation, and you can see them on screen here, but the changes I made between the 3DS animations is just a matter of preference. Instead of going with flowy movements, I altered them to be a bit more impactful. When Lilligant is dancing and they jump upward, I tried to accentuate the movement of their skirts. It was already there to begin with, I just made it a bit more noticeable. When they land, I wanted to make it seem like there's a point of impact. So the upper body plunges into the skirt when it lands, and then it pushes upward off its flower, which gives the jump an illusion of momentum. But like, this is just me explaining something that's already here. The animators thought of all this. They considered how the bulb would move like a skirt and that the leaves at the waist would function as an overskirt. Seems like a lot of effort for folks who don't care about what they're doing. The personality of Pokemon that share similar real-world counterparts are different as well. Like I said earlier, Growlithe has a lot of energy, so when you're interacting with it, it's moving a lot more. Its tail is wagging and it's constantly jumping around. If you compare that to Stoutland, which is a large stoic dog, Stoutland looks less expressive, but that's not necessarily true. It wouldn't make sense for Stoutland to be acting like a puppy with a lot of energy. I do want to draw attention to how awesome Growlithe's animations are to begin with. You can tell someone looked at a dog and then looked at Growlithe and said, yeah, that's perfect. The way the tail wags and how it wiggles its body reminds me of a real dog. I have to keep reminding myself to say dog because I call every dog I see a puppy, but that's probably confusing if you don't do the same thing. When I altered Growlithe's animations, I didn't really do much. Its idle animation is really short, so there's not much time to do anything crazy. I paid attention to the way it was moving and then just exaggerated the momentum. When it shakes its head and its tail, I wanted them to have some weight because I think the head needed some energy, and the tail is fluffy so it would need some force to move around. I also wanted to pick a more obscure Pokemon to look at just in case folks were like, well, they put more effort into those models because they're popular Pokemon. Okay, I present to you Jumpluff. This is a cottonweed, okay? A literal plant. Apparently they look like this. Someone looked at this piece of cotton button and said, "This is a baby." I'm convinced that's the case. The way it kicks its legs and how delicate its movements are, maybe you're looking at me and thinking, Vanilla, that's Jumpluff and not a baby. And if you do say that, we can't be friends. Even though Jumpluff is probably not a lot of folks' favorite Pokemon, they still took the time to make their animations unique. They took all the features into account when deciding how they'd move. The fact that it literally weighs nothing explains why its movements are floaty and somewhat slow. When I worked on their animations, I personally wanted them to look like they were getting swept around by the wind. They already kind of do that, but I wanted a strong breeze as opposed to the gentle rustling of leaves. Isn't that poetic? There's a lot more attention to detail paid to these models by the 3D artists than I think a lot of folks can appreciate, especially those who think the artists behind the animations weren't passionate about what they were doing. Sometimes I think that disgruntled fans believe if the folks working on a Pokemon title haven't been fans since before they could walk and talk, that they will never be able to do the series justice. The Gen 9 models are really cutting edge and their movements are just so fluid and realistic. Looking at them in an isolated environment with appropriate hardware allows you to truly appreciate what they're capable of. I think it's really easy to criticize the older models, especially since folks don't like the fact that the 3DS animations and models were reused time and time again. I think the idea is that Game Freak should have been changing these animations instead of reusing them, so for each game, each Pokemon would get a new set of animations. I guess you could do that. I don't really know what that would look like, and I don't know how you would go about changing the movements of each Pokemon for each new game. And a Pokemon looks the way it does, so I don't think there's really any need to alter the way models look unless you're going to do a complete graphical overhaul like they did with Gen 9. Whether or not you agree with the reuse of models, there's a very good reason why it was done. The models were designed to a superior standard in Gen 6, so much so that they were able to be used across multiple generations and maintain their functionality and style. When the models were designed in Gen 6 and the series moved on to Gen 7, the models were created in a format that was identical to those in Gen 6. This made it easy to incorporate the older models so that way they could add more Pokemon into the game without needing to remodel each Pokemon for each new generation. The models managed to maintain the same style, and what changed between the generations was texturing in the lighting engine, which allowed for the games to have somewhat different styles while the appearance of the Pokemon stayed consistent. The models in the Let's Go games on the Switch are pretty much identical to those from the 3DS era, but if you think they look better, it's probably because of the lighting and the textures. I wanted to end this video by showing a mock battle loop. You can see the original Jumpluff and Growlithe animations as they exist in Sun and Moon, and then this is my altered version. I made the assumption that the problem with the original models was that they weren't constantly moving around. I don't know. Obviously, I'm happy with what I did, but I don't know if the animations are actually the problem. I think the general sentiment of very disgruntled fans is the issue. What can be done to make these folks happy? I'm not sure. And considering they don't ever actually identify what's wrong outside of reused models and lazy animations, I don't even know if they know. I'd love to know what about the animations and model designs they don't like, just so I can understand it for myself. So thank you so much for watching my little yap sesh. If you enjoyed the video and me, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing to my channel if you haven't already. I make all different kinds of Pokemon content, and if that's kind of your thing, you should totally subscribe for more. If you want to see even more of my antics, I'm active on Blue Sky as well as TikTok. I'll leave some of those links down below if you're interested. As always, I hope you have an amazing day and I hope to see you again next time. Okay, bye!